Hello and welcome to Fidelity Connects. I'm Pamela Ritchie. President Trump has been in office for just 3 short days and has already announced several economic policy measures across the boards, and it is his 25% tariff threat on Canadian imports, which could be imposed as soon as February 1st. That, of course, has Canadians on the edge of their seat. With Trudeau having stepped down as Prime Minister and a federal government prorogued until March 24th, how is Canada preparing to address the impending tariffs discussion? And how might Canada and America's shifting political landscapes influence fiscal policies and potentially your investment strategies? Joining us here today to unpack all of this and more is former provincial PC leader Tim Hudak, who is now partner at Counsel Public Affairs, one of Canada's leading public affairs agencies, and former federal PC minister and NAFTA council member James Moore, joining us from Vancouver. Welcome, Tim. Welcome, James. Delighted to have a chance to speak with each of you here today.
Great to be back on Fidelity Connects.
Yeah, fantastic to have you back here in the chair, Tim. And James Moore, I wonder if we might ask you a little bit for your thoughts on the inauguration. Let's just go to the pomp and circumstance of it all. It was something to behold.
Well, back in January of 2017, when Donald Trump became president, I think people were still kind of in shock that he had won the campaign. And I remember being at the embassy in Washington, and people were kind of looking at each other left and right, wondering, like, did that really happen? Is this really happening? And, you know, the speech itself, in terms of its prose and its emphasis, was a lot about doom and gloom and darkness. And obviously that depends on your perspective of things. But this speech, I think, was much more staid. It had some of the heated rhetoric, but also it shows a sign that President Trump is now 8 years older. He has, I think, a little bit more understanding and a measured understanding of what it is to be president of the United States. And I think he's being a lot more deliberate about what it is that he wants to do. He also knows that there's higher expectations than last time. He won the popular vote. He controls the House and the Senate. Controls the House and the Senate as well, with people around him who are hardline believers in what he's doing. There's no Paul Ryan there as Speaker of the House like there was last time. There's no Mitch McConnell, sort of a classic institutionalist, as leader of the Senate to sort of put the brakes and pump the brakes a bit on a Trump agenda. So I think President Trump it was more staid, more measured, still hot by traditional standards, but I think he has a better sort of sense of the landscape and what the expectations are for him to deliver.
Tim Hudak, what do you think?
James did a great analysis there, Pamela. But what I would add to that, I think the president is even more determined this time, in addition to focused. So once they get this agenda done, we'll be thinking legacy right from the get-go. And the second element, Pamela, to add to that is there's another focal point of power that we can't underestimate, and that's Republicans in Congress, particularly the Freedom Caucus. Because the margin is so narrow there in the Republican side, they're going to have a lot of sway. So what are they interested in? Very much an American first policy, reducing spending, trying to control runaway debt in the state. So any trade-off that President Trump wants to make on economic policy is going to have to control spending. And that's why I think tariffs are a serious threat.
Absolutely, and every reason to keep them in the forefront and take them seriously. James Moore, you were right at the top of the Harper government for many years. I'm curious what you think about the elements of deregulation, which you can almost tie every story into right now, as well as tax policy. Both of those are probably going to filter down into many, many, many conversations over the next while. What do you give us a little bit of a forecast of how you see things changing for our country and maybe globally?
Well, I think it'll shift a lot on both sides of the borders. Tim's point there, by the way, about what a lot of the sort of weaponization of the Trump agenda is fueled by is an important sort of North Star to guide us by quite a bit, right? When George W. Bush was president of the United States, the U.S. national debt was roughly about $5 trillion. Today, the United States government adds $1 trillion in new debt every 100 days. So the scale and scope of indebtedness in the United States is dramatic. It's not affordable. It's not sustainable. And I think President Trump, given that he does have a tax cut agenda, and he does want to sort of have, obviously avoid a debt crisis under his timing, he is of the belief, and it's not anything new. He wrote about this back in 1987 in a full-page ad in a New York newspaper when he was thinking of running for president back then. He does believe, rightly or wrongly, but it's what he believes, that tariffs are a tax that foreigners pay for the privilege of doing business in the United States. And There's everything wrong about that belief, but it is his belief. And so government and policymakers have to sort of manage their way around it. I think it will, to your point, push into the forefront the obligation for Canada to re-rationalize and modernize the way in which we do business, both east and west and north and south. And interprovincial trade barriers have to be on the agenda, and we have to be more robust about it. I mean, the scale of complicated regulatory burdens that exist for Canadian businesses who want access to markets east and west in Canada that they do now have the privilege of having access to in the United States are not on par, and that needs to be reimagined and sort of reactivated. And I think you'll see that should Pierre Poilievre become Prime Minister, I think be a real focal point of his time as Prime Minister.
Tim Hudak, your thoughts on, I mean, think about the elements of deregulation. They could go to healthcare. The U.S. healthcare deregulation story is a massive story because they're looking to cut costs there pretty significantly. But what does it mean for Canada, deregulation? We'll go to taxes as well.
It's a roller coaster. I mean, my advice to Fidelity Connect's investors out of the gate is fasten your seatbelt. But at the end of the ride, I think it's actually going to work out for us. And I'll tell you why, and I know Pamela will get into details. Certainly the pressure, the turmoil we're going through here now, we will be hit by tariffs. It will impact our economy. But in the long run, I don't think this is going to be about punishing Canada when it comes to trade issues. I think it's about cooperating in other ways. For example, spending more on our military, getting Canada back to the traditional role we had through the Second World War in Korea, and pulling our weight. I think it's going to lead to more deregulation in the Canadian economy, a good thing. So sectors around transportation, telecommunications, agriculture, I think.
Digital services?
Digital services, absolutely. And thank God, right? Like at the end of the day, we have policies that are holding back Canadian growth. They're holding back Canadian investment. I think at the end of the day, Pamela, at the end of this ride, when we get off this roller coaster, we'll have less regulation, more jobs, a stronger military, and a more sensible immigration policy.
James Moore, do you think that the rollback of a number of tax policies from the Liberal government over the course of the last several days really is indicative of just exactly reacting to Trump in other ways? They're getting ready in other ways. But what do you think about those rollbacks?
Well, yeah, and I think Pierre Poilievre signaled to, I mean, for example, right out of the gate of the most recent tax measure that the Liberals have put in place under Trudeau and Freeland on the capital gains side, and Pierre Poilievre right away saying he's opposed to it and he'll repeal it right away. That's really important in terms of symbolic, not just in terms of the sort of apples to apples competitive disadvantage that we find ourselves in relative to the United States, but also you think about this in terms of human capital. A lot of young people who are entirely mobile, who have the capacity to move into the United States or into Canada. You know, it seems like Elon Musk is probably winning the battle within the White House, the administration on the visa side. But there are a lot of young Canadians who are upwardly mobile, who we want to be great achievers and builders and entrepreneurs within Canada. They need those symbols and those signs from an incoming possible Pierre Poilievre government that better is on the horizon, that you're not going to be attacked and beaten up because you're successful. And the tools for businesses to grow, to sort of incent people to invest into an enterprise or an idea or a project or IP and be rewarded down the line for your hard work and ingenuity, that those tools of punishment will be taken off the table because we want Canada to grow. So I think a lot of the measures that you'll see as counterbalancing measures to keep Canada competitive, you know, in the years ahead, are frankly as much about dollars and cents and aligning Canada competitively as it is as much about sending a signal to young Canadians and entrepreneurs and so on that Canada is a place that you want to be, and you're going to have a government that's not going to beat you up for being successful anymore.
Pro-business.
Here, right? I agree with James 100%, and I think a likely Poilievre election, I mean, a lot of what James said lines up with creating more opportunity, you know, less red tape, more investment, and greater trade. Look, energy is a great example of that as well, right. Pamela. The energy relationship with the states has been terrible. We basically have the No Pipelines Act to allow, you know, any more flow of oil and gas within Canada. I think that, well, Trump might look like the Darth Vader right now, and will get hit in some way. At the end of the day, I think it'd be a galvanizing figure that make us look at some of this antiquated system and red tape that slows down investment. So we'll get that point. So I think the game here is to figure out, okay, if they want some revenue through tariffs, they can get that through China and elsewhere. What's the trade-off with the Americans to their benefit? And that's greater access to our markets, greater trade, and a steady flow of energy, and hopefully things like critical minerals to benefit both of our economies.
Yeah, really interesting. James, we're provincial elections. I'm thinking about Ontario. We're sitting here today and we don't know if a provincial election is going to be announced, but it seems likely, let's put it that way. What ultimately on sort of the province to province level, are they getting ready for? This is sort of the retaliate to not retaliate mandate.
Different provinces are doing different things. I'll leave it to Tim to talk about the province of Ontario in more detail, but different provinces are doing different things. The government of Quebec has aligned with former Premier Charest and has him effectively as an envoy. He's also sitting on a NAFTA council group that I'm affiliated with. Daniel Smith, the governor of Alberta, has an envoy down in Washington, James Rajat, who's been down there for a few years now, who's developed a great network of alliances and friends who are accretive to the Alberta-U.S. relationship. Wab Canoe has worked with Gary Dewar, former Canada ambassador down there. So unlike 2016 when President Trump was elected the first time, this time, we do have a lot of muscle memory, frankly, from the trauma of the past few years of dealing with this administration. And there are a lot of people who sort of, built up a lot of muscle memory and capacity to protect the Canadian interest going into the United States. The provincial elections will complicate things, and that's why I'm quite frustrated about the dynamic that we find ourselves in as a consequence of Justin Trudeau's decision to step away, right? We have a lame duck, as you outlined, a lame duck government in Ottawa. You have a prime minister who's trying to sort of put together a Team Canada dynamic. Meanwhile, two of his senior ministers, his House leader and now former finance minister, along with Mark Carney, are competing for the Liberal leadership and prime ministership outside of the rubric of government. And no matter what Justin Trudeau does, they will be challenged to say that they're more or less like Justin Trudeau, and they all want to push away from Trudeau. So that's going to create a tension. And then you have Doug Ford likely going into an election campaign trying to distinguish himself from Justin Trudeau and the incumbent government, because that's why you need to elect him uniquely. And then you're going to have Pierre Poilievre on the sidelines waiting for the outcome of the federal Liberal leadership race to challenge whoever comes out of that and chastise their approach and say that he's got it better. None of this dust will settle probably until late May, early June, when we go through a federal election campaign and the rinse cycle, and then we sort of see what we've got with probably a new Conservative government, the naming of a new cabinet, them getting their briefings, the changes in Privy Council office and all that. So it's my long way of saying, the first half of 2025 are probably going to be burned in terms of our opportunity to reach out coherently to the United States because of all of this internal political dynamic.
Hopefully they'll have other fish to fry around the world so we can get ourselves settled and organized to do that. Tim Hudak, Ontario election. Come on, you're the former PC leader. What are your thoughts?
First of all, Fidelity. I'm a Fidelity investor since I was in my 20s, so I know you're thinking, Pamela, for 10 years now. Thank you for saying that's been a bit longer.
I wasn't going to do your math for your own age. Don't worry.
And I really like how you inform your clients, right, about what's going to be happening. So this is, I'll tell you, it's not a prediction, it's a spoiler. Doug Ford is going to launch the election. It'll happen next Wednesday for 28 days after. That will be a Thursday. He will be returned with a strong majority government. It's part of the roller coaster. We're putting our arms up in the air to make it a bit more, rollicky. But that will happen with a renewed Doug Ford mandate.
And what ultimately will that mandate do? I mean, you can say reach across and do this, but I mean, really, it's coming down to a manufacturing sector. What's going to happen?
It gets him 4 more years, really. Does Doug Ford have to call an election? He doesn't have to call an election. He does have time to govern. But politically, it makes a lot of sense to do so. I'll give you a couple reasons why. The Conservative government in Ontario doesn't want to follow a future Poilievre Conservative budget because they're going to reduce spending. It'll be controversial, and that could impact the PCs in Ontario. Doug Ford is in a strong position. I mean, he is running a masterclass in political communication, basically being Captain Canada. Politically, you want to take advantage of it. And third, having been a leader of an opposition party, you want every moment to cut through. How are you different from the current government? What do you want to do differently? That's going to be very hard for Marit Stiles and Bonnie Crombie to do, because every day we'll be talking a lot about Donald Trump and Ford's reaction. They'll have difficulty squeezing through.
Okay. So as you say, it's a little bit up in the air until all that settles, but ultimately that's coming to the fore. Take us back to the NAFTA Council, James Moore, if you don't mind, a little bit. This is what we used to call the USMCA. It's got a few different names. Just clarify for us, this free trade deal under Brian Mulroney, we know what it was, we know it was renegotiated, we know it comes back up for renegotiation. How do just blanket tariffs, depending on how big they are, fit with a free trade deal?
They don't. They're entirely contradictory, and they violate the agreement. But Donald Trump has a mandate, and he was elected saying he was going to do it. So here we are. The NAFTA Council that I was a part of was brought together by Minister Freeland, by Jerry Butts when he was principal secretary to the Prime Minister, and by the Prime Minister himself, to bring together people from east, west, center right, center left, labor, OEMs, entrepreneurs, and so on. And the group wasn't so big that it was inefficient and cumbersome, but it was sort of a tidy group of about 18 Canadians. I was one of them, who brought together public policy experience and all those backgrounds to give genuine Canada first advice to the government of Canada. And through the sweep of when we were assembled in the summer of 2017, going into the negotiations of the USMCA or the CUSMA agreement in the fall of 2017 through until its ratification at 2020, in those 3 years, were rocky 3 years for the Canada-U.S. relationship between Trump and Trudeau. We had the steel and aluminum tariffs and the countervailing duties that Canada put in place, which we're now on the precipice of, as well as a countermeasure that the government of Canada is not only considering, but will do should the tariffs come in on March 1st. So that's part of the muscle memory that I described, right? Is that you have a lot of people who have worked in this space, dealt with the Trump administration, dealt with Bob Lighthizer, and now his former chief of staff, who is going to be the chief negotiator for President Trump again. It's interesting that I saw in the last couple of days this musings that the White House may now want to move up the renegotiations of NAFTA or the USMCA and sort of deal with the tariff issue and the USMCA at the same time. So we've sort of got carrot and stick on the table at the same time. But that puts Canada in a really awkward spot because we have a government that can't actually effectively negotiate with a clear mandate.
Right. Might be part of the reason to put them together. Catch you at a difficult moment. Take us into this world of renegotiating our life with the United States. We know that they are the biggest buyer of Canadian goods. Do you see that we just sort of buy more and sell more? This is one of the messages from Danielle Smith right now, that you just don't worry about the retaliation so much as offering more on both sides, buying and selling.
I think that's where we end up, but here's where I'll disagree with Premier Smith in terms of how we get there. The first big lump on that roller coaster is going to be some retaliatory tariffs. I think Donald Trump is a bully, and if you immediately cave into that bully, I think they just ask for more. So I suspect there will be a quid pro quo initially, and then we try to motivate Americans to talk to other Americans to pull back, and you move to that larger deal. I am confident, Pamela, at the end of the day, this will be good news for Canada in terms of more sensible immigration, stronger defense spending, less regulation to empower our economy, including in the energy sector. But I suspect in the short term, probably right through maybe June or July, that we're going to have a quid pro quo when it comes to tariffs and other trade impediments.
James Moore, if you were to boil it down, this is a bit unfair, but if you were to boil it down to one issue, is it just that we don't spend enough on defense and we really have to?
No, I think it's a worldview. Donald Trump, and it's not something, frankly, you're going to shatter. You just have to manage. We just have to ride the bull here for the next 4 years, in the sense that Donald Trump has a view that countries are like two casinos on the Jersey boardwalk who are competing with each other, and if it's good for you, it's bad for me. If you're doing well, we must be doing less well, as opposed to seeing countries as individual states with sometimes co-equal interests, sometimes competitive interests, and he doesn't see Canada necessarily as an ally, and that's a problem. So we have to shatter that. Your point there in your preamble when you just asked Tim a question about goods going into the United States, let's put a finer thing on it, right? Like the energy that's going into the Gulf of, I guess, Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America, right. That comes from Canada. America's golden era that Donald Trump wants to bring into is going to be literally fueled by Canadian fuel. Pasta across the shelves in the United States, all of that pasta, except for really high-end expensive stuff, comes from wheat that's found in Canada. The lights of New York are all lit up by energy that comes from Canada, and so we do have tools at our disposal to put some squeeze on and put some countervailing pain into the United States to say, look, we are friends and allies. But this is going to be a long burn. Even if we had a coherent government and we could sort of do the tariffs and the trade deal at the same time, imagine we were able to do that in calendar 25. Donald Trump randomly put in tariffs against steel and aluminum with his 232 capability, and Canada had to put in countervailing. So I think we're on a 4-year rinse cycle here that's going to be very complicated, because Donald Trump will look to castigate and blame foreigners, broadly speaking, for differing challenges domestically in America. Nothing is ever his fault. It's always the fault of some other outside of nefarious power or some kind of deep state something. Nothing's ever his fault. And Canada will take its turn sometime in the next 4 years beyond these issues as being to blame for something in the American economy for which he will have to bring out a hammer in his view. So that requires the government to be nimble, thoughtful, creative about how we sort of counteract that and build long-lasting relationships that will endure past these rocky 4 years of the Trump administration.
Within the country, Tim Hudak, do you see us closing up our gaps? I mean, for instance, for decades, we've been more dependent on how housing contributes to the economy. We all know this. This is your expertise. This is one of your many portfolios. How will the economy of Canada be rebalanced? Presumably, it's good to rebalance away from housing being such a large piece of the tax profile of this country.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, look how the energy sector has been crippled under the current government, that potential robbed away. The fact that, as James mentioned right off the top, the interprovincial trade barriers are limiting opportunity, migration of talent and new job creation. I believe this pressure that's brought to bear will finally cause these to be knocked down. We'll have a new government in Ottawa that believes in that. So I remain optimistic. So here's one thing I want to add to the discussion too. One benefit we do have is that Donald Trump can sell anything to his audience. He can basically say this was a great deal and maybe it won't be too much. So anticipating, how we get to that level where he's going to be satisfied with us and then turn to other major countries, dealing with China, for example, Ukraine and Russia, will occupy his attention. I suspect, I wasn't there, James at the inauguration, I'm jealous, but I suspect the reason why we were not in the inaugural speech and we were just going to get a study until 6 p.m. then when Trump said, no, 25% tariffs February 1, because we're not as high on their radar screen as we think we are.
Okay.
Which is
James,
a good thing.
What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think a lot of that is true, and that's a good place to be. It's a good place to be, right? And so, the red hats and the people who went to the rallies who want some red meat fed to them in the next little while, they have their emphasis set on culture war politics. That's why you saw stuff about two genders as an executive order from the government, all that stuff. But the immigration stuff is real. The border stuff is real. The crisis with the United States is real. The crisis with the U.S.-Mexico border is real. It's certainly in the eyes and the perception of those in border states across the U.S. and those who are really animated by those issues. People who feel that the country they're losing the ability to control their country because they see the decay in urban America and they're blaming excessive immigration inflows for that. And so that's where the hardcore base of the Trump sort of momentum is, and that's the beast that needs to be fed in the immediate term. So Canada has a window here. We're going to be hit with tariffs. We have a window here to try to countervail and influence that as best we can. But it's, as I said, it's going to be it's going to have a long tail to all of this.
I might just come back to housing for a second, Tim Hudak, because we've got a whole interest rate macro story backdrop that is affecting the housing story. We know that immigration has impacted that severely, and that policy has changed a bit as well. But what does further uncertainty do to sort of the housing story? There's a few new pieces to come to bear here. Tell us a little bit about the housing picture from your perspective.
Pamela, if it was on Fidelity Connects back in December, I'd be much more optimistic about what 2025 is going to look like in housing, and I remain long-term optimistic. But in the short term, I think we're going to see what could have been a decent spring market not actually come to fruition, and here's why. The housing market hates uncertainty. And certainly at Counsel Public Affairs, we're hearing that from clients that are saying, well, should we continue to invest? Should we buy that new site, increase our manufacturing? They're not sure where things are going with tariffs in the intermediate term. And that means those new jobs, the promotions, whatever that we would count on to say I'm going to move up and get a better house, that's going to be on hold. In my 7.5 years at the Ontario Real Estate Association as a CEO, pretty easy. The math is 50% finance, 50% psychology. And right now the psychology is quite negative, so I think the bounce back is going to be delayed probably till summer and fall as opposed to spring.
Okay, really, really interesting on that thought. James, I want to ask you a little bit about the evolving Canadian economy. Housing is one piece of it. There's discussion of AI, there's the discussion of data centers. It's all over the news. Larry Ellison is making massive investments in the US. This is a North American story, this is a global story, and it requires an awful lot of power, of which we have. Where does Canada fit in this story? Where should we be directing what we have to give to this new dawn?
Well, Canada does have a mixed economy. So, unlike sort of the pure, simple free marketeering or a command economy, like those absolutes, we do have a managed economy. And you see it with regard to the auto sector in Ontario, the EV stuff, the stuff that, frankly, the Liberals did sort of in their first iteration under Trudeau with their super cluster policy. Stephen Harper, we had our sort of industrial policy that was a response to the '08 economic crisis with focused measures and investments in key parts of the economy. AI could very well be part of that. I mean, I could imagine Premier Smith and the conversations that she's having in Alberta being actually being a possible viable product and project for Canada moving forward. I think a big part of this, though, of course, will be dictated by the trade relationship, and this wall that exists now in front of us in terms of public policy is going to be fundamental. And also, I think that the style that comes along with the Trump administration, like it's one thing to sort of think that, for some people to think that him joking about a 51st state is kind of funny. Canadians don't think that's funny. Canadians take that very seriously. They take that as an insult and a threat, and they don't think it's funny. And so the ability to do business on a continental basis with an administration that domestically is toxic to your political universe of voters that you need to keep satisfied in order to stay in office, that's going to be a challenge, because it's one thing for us to have a modified trade deal or to stare down the tariffs and get to something that's more rational in the long term. But if at the same time President Trump is doing large-scale deportations of immigrants, or aliens as they call them, which kind of hits the Canadian ear a little rough in terms of sort of dehumanizing people who are in the United States. If there's large-scale deportations and encampments in the United States, and Trump has his elbows up and is doing rough stuff because he doesn't care about re-election, to try to sort of partner with the United States and get that sort of passive consent or from Canadians in order to go forward, I think that's a challenge as well. Because if Donald Trump makes America toxic to sort of swing voters in Canada, the ability for us to partner on large-scale projects that will require some kind of government, either infrastructure or regulatory approval, that's going to prove challenging as well. So this is a 3D relationship, 4D relationship with the United States, not just on policy, also on personality, also on how the public responds to the policy and personality and the tone of things, so that governments can have mandates to actually sit down and try to arrange these things.
Can I add a point on
Please.
energy? Yeah,
yes.
the other part of energy we've not talked about yet that I'm very bullish on is nuclear energy as
Yes.
well. Ontario,
Well,
as
this
you know,
is what I'm getting to.
expanding
Yep.
4 additional sites in Ontario, potential in Saskatchewan and Alberta. The Americans have a tremendous difficulty siting new nuclear plants. And so with the energy ties, we have an extraordinary opportunity not only to supply the data centers you talked about, but become active energy exporters, oil, gas, and hydroelectricity.
Citing it for NIMBYism reasons?
Yeah,
or?
they just have it as a difficult record, yet the legal system in the state slows things down. They're privately run in the states, whereas we have in Ontario that public-private partnership. So we've seen as a very strong model for clean, affordable energy, and we seem to have our act together when it comes to now expanding and siting new nuclear plants.
James, wouldn't mind your comments on that, but I'll just get to this question. Is there anything that the prorogued Canadian government can do? Well, presumably they can retaliate to tariffs, because that's being discussed, but they're kind of stuck.
Yeah, I mean, legislatively they're stuck. The government still does have powers. They can through order in council, which is, order in council is this, our procedural way of saying a majority of the quorum of cabinet. So in the current cabinet, that would be 8 people. If 8 cabinet ministers get together and signed what's called a walk around, which is an order of council, basically a directive to amend certain programs. If you look at any piece of legislation, boring political science here, but if you look at any piece of legislation that's passed by the government of Canada, there's always basically a very final section, the last few paragraphs, that all say that, in order to enact this legislation, government and council, GIC, can use their OIC, order and council powers in order to enact this, to sort of execute the substance of this. That's beyond the necessity of legislation. So the government will have some latitude to do this, but the problem, of course, is that while they functionally can do some of these things substantively, Justin Trudeau's out of gas. Only 16% of Canadians think that he should still be the prime minister. That's not a phenomenal mandate against a guy, Donald Trump, whose approval ratings have gone up since Election Day, and he has a majority in the House and the Senate and the popular vote. And obviously he commands big swaths of digital and social media to push his message. So we are in a weakened state right now, and it's very, very problematic.
James Moore, are you going to get yourself to Ottawa and get elected and get back into government?
I am not. I did that 5 times. I said, you're free to do so. So is Tim.
I'm going to vote. I'll vote for both of you.
Public-private partnerships. I mean, public means something different from what we're talking about. Public markets are the stock markets is what we're talking about. But what you're really talking about is the government public-private partnerships. We need a lot more of them, presumably, right?
Absolutely. I mean,
what's going to clear the path? We need a John the Baptist here to clear the path to make some of those actually happen.
Yeah, certainly it's been a big success with Bruce on the nuclear side. When we see projects like Metrolinx in Ontario on the transportation side, I think that shows we need to fix our procurement process. But I think, Pamela, to that point, at the end of the day, the opportunity to attract foreign investment into 3Ps. We've seen so many of our Canadian pension plans investing in the UK and Europe and the States instead of here in Canada. I remain an optimist. If we get to an environment that actually rewards entrepreneurship, less regulation, so it doesn't take a decade to get a subdivision or a pipeline built, that's going to be good for repatriating that investment to build our economy. James
Moore, Keystone XL, is that a goer?
Well, we'll see. We'll see what the market dynamics look like going forward. But I mean, Tim's sort of hinted at, and it's sort of laced through a number of his answers, and it's one of the things why I like Tim so much is that we have an obligation to look for the opportunities in things, and the rhetoric of, frankly, traditional opponents of pipelines and capacity building are going to be confronted with their hypocrisy. If you don't like Donald Trump holding Canada hostage, well, then how about you don't give him the keys to the cuffs? And that's what Canada has been doing for far too long on energy exports, whether it's traditional in the past the proposal to go north through Mackenzie Valley or expanding Keystone XL, the Northern Gateway, even the slow walk that we're seeing now on the Kinder Morgan, well, formerly the Kinder Morgan pipeline, yes, out to Burnaby, which is not far from where I'm sitting right now. Like all of these norms, I think will be challenged. I think in a very good way.
What's the football helmet you got behind you there? Who's...
Washington Huskies. It's not the Winnipeg. It's not the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. My father went to the University of Washington, so
really?
it's a wink at him.
So you know what?
Yeah.
Let's talk about the border. Okay.
I went to the University of Washington.
Did you?
Hopefully not at the same time as James' dad, but I'm a Husky grad myself.
We're not doing any age math here. This is not what this show is
1963.
Let's talk about the border, Ontario. Then I want to talk about it in BC. Obviously, this is a massive focus. What do you see trends changing? I mean, we're going to have a lot more drones. We already have a lot more drones. But what else?
Let's
use the technology. It's going to be hard to get through the border.
Coordinate, right? In two senses. Okay. So, believe it or not, Huskies grad. I was actually a border inspector for a while as well when I was paying my way through university. And you
buried the lead, Tim. We needed to start with this.
I can write a book on how to not get caught smuggling. But very little coordination between the American and the Canadian side, and technology should enable that. The bad guys we both want to keep out of North America. So use technology with the drones. I would love to see us, instead of having customs on both sides of the border, you go through customs before you go across the border and have the potential to blow up the bridge while you're in the middle of it. And the third point here, I'd like to see an idea resurrected to have more of a North American security perimeter. We can decide if Mexico's allowed it or not, depending on if they pull up their socks. But to have, similar standards to keep, violent criminals, terrorists, threats to both sides of the border, I hope that is an outcome of this process as well.
Okay. James, tell us about, first of all, how often either you or the people that you speak to, your family, use the border. You can go across for dinner.
Yeah, I would say probably once a quarter, at least for me, but mostly it's for leisure, right? Going to either a Seahawks game or a Kraken game, go to see my Canucks lose on the road. It's typically what happens. But no, I think it's quarterly, but obviously it's an important point that you raised, though, right? The diversity of the Canada-U.S. border, east and west, is really quite complicated. 61% of New Brunswick's GDP is dependent on access to the United States. It's a third of Ontario's GDP, more than that. In British Columbia, it's less than half. And so the emphasis and the strain is very different. The physical infrastructure dynamics are different. The relationships between the borders are different in terms of stresses. And frankly, the northern flow of guns, drugs, and is very different. You look at Quebec and the conversation that's been had, a hot conversation about Roxham Road and the illegal flow of migrants north. So when we talk about as a country about having sort of a continental border process with the United States, the on-the-ground politics and the relationship and the infrastructure dynamic is very different at Roxham Road than it is at the Blaine border crossing, than it is on the Blue Bridge, than it is at the Gordie Howe, like all that. So I think it does require a better story. But another silver lining, by the way, about all this, we can emphasize the dark, which is a rational, normal thing to do, because you want to bring that to the surface so you can mitigate it as investors and as policymakers. But on the other side, Marco Rubio being Secretary of State is a good thing. He's a guy who's got a long track record of understanding the geopolitical position of Canada in a net positive way for our relationship with the United States. Incoming Ambassador Hoekstra, former governor of a border state in Michigan, who understands the complexity of the Michigan, Ontario, and Canada relationship. That's a net positive thing. So there are people who are around the table who, when push comes to shove and things start getting gritty, they'll kind of put up their hand and say, there's a counterbalancing story to all this. So there are some, for lack of a more pedantic word, that there are some adults in the room who can sort of speak positively to the border relationship.
Such a great point that the border dynamics are just such a vast border that they are so different. I want to just go back to sort of the story actually of Quebec and China. There's a couple of things we want to put in here, but this goes to sort of the interprovincial discussion, the trade. There's a supply management story that needs to be discussed. Tim, I'm going to toss that to you. Bye-bye supply management. What's going to happen here?
So here I don't have a spoiler. I just have to make a prediction. I think any pressure we can put on our regulatory structure that drives up the cost of basic groceries and the knock-on effects is going to be ultimately good for Canadians. I think will help us get greater access to the U.S. and other markets as well. You do a nice job linking what's happening in Quebec, a potential reigniting of separatist forces in the province of Quebec would heavily resist breaking up the dairy supply management, for example. But when you hear some of the Americans, as James mentioned, who have friendly relationships with Canada, agriculture tends to drive a lot of those discussions. So I put this on my optimist ending that will actually allow greater access into markets and help get food more affordable for average Canadians.
James, Quebec is the biggest province and a massive economy in this country. What do you think the next several years spell for Quebec? Supply management is one small, well, it's a small piece, but it's a piece. But what ultimately for the relationship of Quebec in this important relationship within our country?
So if calendar 25, assume Justin Trudeau is going, assume the new Liberal leader is coming, and then assume Pierre Poilievre wins the election and he's prime minister by mid-June of this year. The rest of calendar 25 will be dominated by Donald Trump, and that'll be a distinguishing feature of the next 4 years of Pierre Poilievre as prime minister. In 2026, a calendar year from now, thereabouts, maybe a little deeper into 26, will rise the province of Quebec, because they're going into a provincial campaign in October of 2026. And, we have, for the first time in our lifetime, the traditional dynamic of Quebec politics is you have the Parti Québécois, separatist party, basically since the Quiet Revolution, who have been the party of the Pure Land Francophone Québécois and the voice of les Québécois in North America. When François Legault became Premier of Quebec, he became the first leader of a federalist party, notionally federalist party, that is Francophone based, that stole the base away from the Parti Québécois and became a Francophone implanted based party that is not a separatist party. Well, now their party, after COVID, has fallen down. They're 20 points down in the polls behind the Parti Québécois, not the Quebec Liberal Party. And so in 2026, calendar 26, there's going to be effectively a primary, which will also reflect in the general election, between the Coalition Avenir Québec, the incumbent Quebec government, and the Parti Québécois, about which party is the real voice of les Québécois, la fait des francophones, the Francophone fact in the North American footprint. And that's going to be very divisive and challenging for Pierre Poilievre and the government of Canada. For a bunch of reasons. Pierre has promised to defund the CBC. The CBC is the national public broadcaster. It's also the physical infrastructure that protects the French language in the North American continent. That's how it's seen by a lot of Quebecers. That's a problem. You have supply management conceivably on the table as a target for Donald Trump. That's a problem, because that'll be seen as a motherhood industry in parts of Quebec that are fundamental to that primary between the Coalition Avenir Québec and the Parti Québécois. Those dairy farmers vote between those two parties and never vote Liberal, and they will want to see who will stand up for them the most as sort of a symbolic dynamic of protecting not only the Quebec culture, but the Quebec economic culture. So these things are all on the table, and they are real sore spots and challenges for the country. So Quebec will be a distinguishing feature in 2026 as much as Donald Trump is right now for Pierre Poilievre and his government.
What is the provincial conversation about addressing the fact that Quebec wants to have, a discussion about where they fit, the voice that it has in this country? What do you think of that, Tim?
I think James laid out, the big battle is going to happen as to, who will represent those Quebec voters. I've always believed, though, that the stronger relationship with the economy. I believe that Canadians tend to vote pocketbook first. What does this mean for my family, for my livelihood, the ability to send my daughters and sons off to university or college? So if I were another premier, I would continue to build those economic relationships, let them have their internal battle, but to show that the ultimate benefit for their families is going to be to continue to building up Canada and not tearing it down.
Okay. James Moore, with a couple of remaining minutes, I want to just discuss, you are in a province that is an Asian province in many ways. The relationship with China economically is massive, consequential, and China, of course, is an absolute target for U.S. tariffs that may be potentially much bigger than U.S. Targets on Canada and Mexico.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a re-rationalized relationship, from the two Michaels being imprisoned and the conversation we had in Canada about banning Huawei equipment in our telecommunications sector. Like those seem like ancient history, but they sort of began this sort of re-rationalization of the relationship. The relationship went from, I think, a deep ice box, frozen, cold, to a little bit warmer, but it's still pretty frozen. And I think that's fueled by a domestic political sentiment around the cost of housing, around the immigration file, which still is pretty hot out here. And even though sensitive and it's hard to communicate for policy, makers to sort of deal with the anxiety that Canadians have about these things while, not frankly canceling yourself politically and going forward. So I think it's going to be a challenge. In a lot of ways, I think we'll be following America, and the Canada-China relationship in terms of two-way trade, especially more outbound trade from Canada, is still, I believe, a massive opportunity for Canada. It's an enormous opportunity. But the opportunity lays 10, 20 years down the road in terms of consequential, real pan-Canadian benefit. But the immediacy of the U.S. relationship is far more important and far more present right now in terms of the quality of life of Canadians. So I think in a lot of ways we'll be following the American lead. And frankly, I don't think that President Trump, aside from some of his rhetoric, I don't know that he's sort of really has a deep sort of thought pattern about his relationship vis-a-vis China. I mean, it's one thing to sort of, castigate China and sort of aggressively pronounce the name of the country. But then on the other hand, you've got the CEO of TikTok up on the dais sitting not behind, but in front of his cabinet ministers, along with Mark Zuckerberg and others, as an invited guest. Right. And most people on the American right view TikTok as sort of an agency of sort of incipient Chinese psyops and foreign policy. So I don't know that America under Trump has quite figured out what China is to be, and Canada will have to sort of measure what our relationship will be, but probably putting our relationship with America first.
Yeah, that's really helpful, because it does seem just a bit confusing. A few different thoughts on how that's all going to come to bear, and at least naming the uncertainty is helpful. James Moore. Tim, I might ask you what you'd like to leave with investors at this moment. There's a number of things you've said. It's going to be a bit of a hot potato for a little while. Be patient, wait. But what do you want to kind of leave investors with? Optimism.
Okay. And again, Pamela, thanks for exploring this early for Fidelity investors. And it's great seeing James again, who's a smart guy and has been through this at a national level. I remain optimistic for what it means for Canada, for our energy sector. I think actually for our agriculture and agri-food sector at the end of the day, for transportation, for telecommunications. I think taxes come down. The pressure has already caused Chrystia Freeland to backtrack on the capital gains tax exclusion rate, right? So we've seen progress despite turmoil in the next few months. On the other hand, I think things coming from China, I think that is going to become a more tense issue, as it should. They've interfered in our elections, our economy, sabotage. We should line up the Americans, the Australians, the British, etc. So I think the trade with China is going to be a weak point, but other countries that can produce similar products, I would bet on those.
Okay, fantastic. James Moore, a final thought to leave with investors today on Fidelity Connects.
The long game is net positive. I often think of the Canada-U.S. relationship as two trees on either side of the fence, and while the main part of the tree, the stumps, may be blockaded by a fence that may go up and down because of the politicians. The reality is at the top, the branches, and at the bottom, the roots are commingling and integrated in ways that are far beyond the reach of politics. You think about the Canada-US relationship on the auto sector. You think about the Columbia River Treaty between British Columbia and Washington State. You think about our Five Eyes partnership, our NATO partnership, our military alignment, our co-equal management of air security across the continent, the need to work together on Arctic sovereignty. Like, we are integrated in ways that are beyond the reach of hot button, ill-tempered politics. And I think that will endure as politicians come and go. This most prosperous relationship in the history of the world will endure, and we will get past this. And I'm very optimistic about that. But 2025 will be rocky until we have that settlement, as I said, in probably late May, mid-June on the federal scene. But there's a lot of opportunity for your investors and others to be engaged and be involved and to make sure their views are known, because it's going to be really critical in these couple months of uncertainty.
Gentlemen, very grateful for your time, your thoughtfulness, your leadership, and we wish you both very well. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be back.
Pleasure's mine.
Thanks for listening to the Fidelity Connects podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to Fidelity Connects on your podcast platform of choice. And if you like what you're hearing, leave a review or a 5-star rating. Fidelity mutual funds and ETFs are available by working with a financial advisor or through an online brokerage account. Visit fidelity.ca/howtobuy for more information. On fidelity.ca, you can also find more information on future live webcasts, and don't forget to follow Fidelity Canada on X. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the participants and not necessarily reflect those of Fidelity Investments Canada ULC or its affiliates. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment, tax, or legal advice. It is not an offer to sell or buy, or an endorsement, recommendation, or sponsorship of any entity or security cited. Read a fund's prospectus before investing. Funds are not guaranteed, their values change frequently, and past performance may not be repeated. Fees, expenses, and commissions are all associated with fund investments. Thanks again, and see you next time.